Get ready for another informative, educational, and inspirational story on one of the hottest podcasts in the world. Forget what your clock says and get comfortable. It's time for another edition of It's Primetime Somewhere with your host, J.D. Williams. Now let's meet today's guest.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of It Is Primetime Somewhere. And I am not even going to attempt to pronounce the last name of my guest today. Blame that on a 64-year-old man who cannot remember anything, including his own last name, for more than 30 seconds. All I can do is introduce him as Stephen. And Stephen, I'm going to let you introduce yourself properly. And then at the same time, I am going to ask you to tell us about you and just who in the world you are. Go ahead.
Well, thanks, JD, and thanks for having me on the show. My name is Stephen Eoannou, and I am a writer based out of Buffalo, New York. I've been writing for a long time, over 30 years, but I've only started writing well for maybe the last 7 or 8. Today we're here to talk about my book, Yesteryear, and coming out in October, and it's my 3rd book that's come out. So I'm very excited about that and very excited to be on the show today.
Oh, great. Well, I'm excited to talk to you about it because I know a little bit about the book, and it just happens to deal with a program that as a kid I watched. I probably knew it by heart as many times as I saw each and every episode. It was just great. And as I told you in the very brief time that we had before we got going, I don't even know that it would survive cancel culture today. I really don't. But it is good, wholesome stuff that I highly recommend. And again, the name of his book is Yesteryear, and I'm going to really quick put this up on screen there where everybody can see it and get an idea. And then also, Stephen, I want you to let us know right off the top where this book can be purchased, and then we'll get into talking about it.
Sure. It's available for pre-order now, either at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, or better yet, go to your indie bookstore and they can pre-order it for you. It'll be published on October 3rd of this year. And you can get it through my website that's going to come up on the screen later on today. Absolutely.
And I'm going to warn my audience as I warned you, because I feel it coming on. I've got a cough coming. So I'm going to mute myself here. And just tell us a little bit about the book while I get myself situated.
Yeah. And, people ask me, where did I get the idea for writing a book about the story of how the Lone Ranger got created? And honestly, I can't remember exactly when I first learned about Fran Striker and who wrote Ranger. Somebody at a party or at a bar, or I read it somewhere. Somehow I found out that Fran Striker, the man who wrote The Lone Ranger and The Green Hornet and Sergeant Preston the Yukon, for that matter, was from Buffalo. And I didn't believe that person. I said, how could that be? I live in Buffalo. I'm a Buffalo-based writer. I would know if the Lone Ranger's creator lived in Buffalo. So I did a little research, and not only was he from Buffalo, but he lived in my neighborhood. I lived in a part of town called the Elmwood Village. And he went to Lafayette High School, which is just a few blocks from my house. He lived over on Granger Place. He was a neighborhood guy. And I didn't know of him. And I asked around just casually, and no one really recognized the name Drake. I couldn't, because he had such an impact on 20th century pop culture. And I did a little research, and I found out that one of the reasons probably the primary reason, was that in 1934, about a little over a year after the Lone Ranger premiered, he sold the rights to the Lone Ranger to the owner of WXYZ in Detroit, a man named George W. Trendle, for $10. And soon after, in the 40s, Trendle began claiming in articles and in interviews that it was he, not Fran Striker, who created the Lone Ranger. And everyone knows, you tell a lie and repeat it often enough, it becomes accepted as the truth.
Right.
And even up until his death in 1971 or 72, maintained the creator of the Lone Ranger. And I think that's why no one really knows of Fran Striker outside of old timers in the radio business, And I was so intrigued with the story that I decided to write a novel about it.
Wow. Well, as I said, I used to watch that show religiously. And now all of this background information that you're giving me is completely brand new to me. I know nothing about that whatsoever. I assume I'm pretty much like everybody else. You know, you see the credits roll on something, but who pays attention to it? I mean, really, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah. Writers, producers, editors, maybe, but general public, nah.
Yeah,
rarely.
So even the last reboot of the Lone Ranger, the movie with Johnny Depp, that now, if you do watch the credits at the end, characters created by George W. Trendle still.
Oh, okay.
And that movie wasn't out that long ago.
When was that out? Do you remember? Do you remember when that last movie came in?
It was in the 90s, I think. I'm not exactly sure about that now.
Okay.
But that was the last one.
Okay.
It was interesting. I mean, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you, are any of the characters from the original still alive? And I'm just asking because I honestly don't have any clue. But are any of them still living?
Well, from the TV series, Clayton Moore passed away, as did Jay Silverheels. So they were, of course, the Lone Ranger and Tonto.
Right.
And I think they passed away within a year of each other.
Wow. Okay.
So.
Yeah. Well, again, it was a great show. It was wonderful entertainment. But now, what caused you to decide to write about it in the first place?
Yeah, I think just the fact that he was a Buffalo guy, and he was a big-hearted guy, and he never got the attention or the financial rewards that really he deserved. And his son, Fran Striker Jr., said in his biography of his dad, depending on how you look at that $10 deal, it was either the best deal in entertainment history or the worst deal in entertainment history, depending on your perspective. But Fran wasn't a dumb man. He did it for good, honorable reasons. This is the Depression, so we're talking 1930 when the Lone Ranger premiered. So this is the 90th anniversary of the Lone Ranger's birth, if you will, on radio.
Right.
And at Striker at that time, he was married. He had 2 small children. The Depression was raging. And in addition to his small family, he was supporting about a dozen other extended family members who had lost everything in the Depression. They were dependent on his income from writing radio scripts. Trendle knew this. Trendle was a very astute businessman and thought that the Lone Ranger was going to turn into something special. And so he offered Striker a job, a contract to come to Detroit, leave Buffalo, become a full-time exclusive writer for WXYZ, and he'd have job security through the Depression where he and his extended family. The condition was he had rights for $10.
$10 to sell the rights to this. Unbelievable. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so Striker, he was torn. I mean, he had never had a national radio hit at this point in his career. He had written probably 24 radio for EBR in Buffalo, New York. Some of them last 4 episodes. Some of them last, 20 or more. But he had no guarantee the Ranger was going to become a cultural phenomenon. He took the deal. He took it. And probably the best explanation that I can find is that in the 30s, after the Ranger took off, continued to work for Trendle, he decided to suggested that they form a kids club for the young viewers. And Striker wrote a creed, the Lone Ranger Creed. And it was tenets of how the young people, the kids of America, should lead their life modeled after the Lone Ranger. And one of those tenets is do what's best for the greater number. And I think that explains why he did it. He did it to support his family. And he did it for the right reasons. And of course, it turned out that, and Trendle honored their agreement. He had a job all through the Depression. In fact, Striker continued to work for WXYZ and for George Trendle. And Trendle sold the rights to the Lone Ranger in 1954 for over $3 million, which was a record sale at that time in the entertainment industry. So his $10 investment turned out pretty well, and Striker and his family never saw any of that money.
That's the sad part. But at least he did have work during the Depression, which is a lot more than a lot of other people did. I can tell you that.
Yeah, and that's the way he looked at it.
Now, the information that I was provided with, of course, tells me that this happened, of course, during the Great Depression, and that he needed to write the pilot, but he had to overcome, first of all, writer's block. You'll have to explain that one a little bit.
Yeah, so this is historical fiction. I didn't write a biography. It's a novel,
Okay.
and this is where the fiction part comes in, because I don't think Fran Striker ever had writer's block a minute in his life.
Okay.
He was a prolific writer. To give you some idea of how much he wrote, he had two writing spaces, two writing areas. One in his house and one in his mother-in-law's house. And when his family and neighbors got so annoyed at him pounding on his Remington 16 typewriter at one house, he would move down the street to pound on the typewriter at the other house. He was constantly writing because he had to support all these people. So that part was just fiction and part of the conflict that I put into the novel itself.
Okay, and how about the gypsy curse that follows that up?
Well, yeah, again, just fiction. When I decided I was going to write about the Lone Ranger, I knew I wanted to write it based in Buffalo, so it would be the period between the time Trendle asked to come up with a Western series until the time it premiered on radio on WEBR in Buffalo in January of 1933. I knew it, so that was my timeline. And I wanted it to make it kind of like the book The Natural by Malamud or Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella with some magical So it was a little bit of myth making I took on about how this man was going to create which became a mythic figure of the Lone Ranger. So yeah, there is a gypsy curse. You know, why else would someone sell the Lone Ranger for $10 unless he was cursed? But she my imagination. But in the novel itself, I brought in real life characters who lived in Buffalo at that time in the early 1930s. Jimmy Slattery, who was the former lightweight heavyweight champion of the world. He was champion for like 134 days, so he wasn't a long-reigning champion, but he was one of Buffalo's favorite sons from South Buffalo. And in the book, he is one of Striker's good friends. John L. Barrett was actually a radio actor who was part of the WEBR radio acting troupe. So remember, these are the early days of radio, a lot different than what you know today, JD, right? I mean, they had full orchestras, they had their own actors and actresses. It was live on the air. It was the first one who ever played the Lone Ranger because the pilot did premiere in Buffalo as a test run before it moved to. So he's there. He's in the book, obviously. There's a mob boss, Stefan Magdiano, who was a real life mafia guy who was in Western New York, and he's in the book. And I even have a cameo appearance by FDR who shows up. I wanted to jump on that real quick about the FDR thing, because the information that I have contained in the book is a plot to assassinate FDR, the only president that ever served, 3 terms, or was it 4? Four terms. Three terms, and didn't make it all the way through the 4th, but he was elected 4 times. No.
So, yeah. Go ahead.
Correct. Yeah. So, and again, this was so long ago. You know, we're used to having our presidents elected in November and sworn in January. But in 1933, it wasn't until I think it was March or April where FDR was sworn in. So he was still president-elect during the time of my novel. So my idea was, Striker was known for writing his action series, The Lone Ranger, The Green Hornet, Sergeant Preston. my idea was, let me write a action novel with some magical realism, with some based on historic fact, with a little bit of noir thrown in, and make it an action, two buddies having an adventure. And the action, the adventure is part of it is to stop a assassination attempt when FDR comes to Buffalo. So there's a lot of moving parts to this novel. You know, he's trying to overcome writer's block. He's trying to come up with a hero for this radio pilot, so he has a deadline, financial pressure, and he's got to keep FDR alive. So it was a fun book to research. It was a fun book to write, and I'm hoping it's a fun book for the readers to read and enjoy.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it for sure. Tell us a little bit about the research that went into this, because this didn't just all fall in your lap, and you didn't write it right off the top without any research involved. So detail that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, and I started just like you. I didn't know who Fran Striker was. I started a clean slate. I didn't recognize the name or anything. So, you know, I was very lucky. Striker passed away in 1962, killed in a car crash, unfortunately. I'm still a young man. I wasn't even 60 years old yet. His family's still in Western New York, and they donated all his papers to the University of Buffalo. So manuscripts, letters, Lone Ranger memorabilia. There's like 24 cartons at the University of Buffalo in their private collections. So I was able to go and sift through all that material, including like the original Lone Ranger script, which, you know, I had to put white gloves on and hold it. So I had all that primary source information. And then there's so much been written about the Lone Ranger, from the early radio days to the TV shows to the marketing that took place. There's just articles and books on it that I was able to find. A lot of articles I got from the public library here in Buffalo. And I did research until I felt full. And that's the best way I can describe it. I don't even know how long it took me to do the research, but I stopped when I felt I have enough to get going. Probably the best book or the most helpful book was, and I had mentioned this earlier, Fran Jr. wrote, and I think it was self-published, to be honest with you, a book called His Typewriter Grew Spurs. And it was his account of his father and his father's legacy. And it was out of print, and I tracked it down. I think it was in a bookstore in Texas someplace. And I was able to get it. And that provided a lot of insight into the thoughts of his dad, and reference letters and diary notes. That was especially helpful. And it really gave an insight into Striker's mind, because he was a very ethical man, really very strong morals, and he never complained about the raw deal he got. He never confronted Trendle about the lie he was telling, that he was the creator of the Lone Ranger. When people would ask in private, Striker would shrug. The people in the radio business, they know the truth. They know I wrote it. And then if he was ever asked in an interview or in public, he would shrug and say, only God creates, which was a kind of a nice way to sort of say, yes, Trendle didn't create it either. Only God creates. So that book by Fran Jr. was very, very helpful to me.
Well, you mentioned that he never really said anything about it, you know, whether or not, or took credit. Was there some kind of written agreement in place, maybe that prevented him from being totally honest about it in public, or do you know?
No, there wasn't a non-disclosure act. I think it was just, Striker
just him
always said it was a legal deal. It was a legal binding contract. They honored the profession. In the 40s, And I guess Trendle, his nickname was the Miser of Motown because he was very cheap, very much a penny pitcher. Had 2 sets of books. During the Depression, he'd show his employees. He'd go, "Look, we're losing money. I can't pay you anymore.
Yeah.
If you don't take a pay cut, I have to let you go." He'd show the same set of books to someone he's going to hire, and I can't pay you very much. And of course, he was making a lot of money. After the Depression, Striker went to him and asked for a raise because he hadn't had one since 1934. And by the Ranger had been on the air on radio for about 8 years. And Trendle fired him. He said,
Wow.
We don't need you anymore. We have the model. We have the characters in place. We have the secret formula, and let him go. And the quality of the writing dropped off so dramatically that the sponsors of not only the other shows that Striker was writing complained to Trendle and said, "Come back." So Trendle hired him back, plus the raise. And Striker worked for him until he sold the rights for television. And then Striker said, "That's it. I'm not going to go out back to Buffalo." And he did. And he was teaching creative writing at the University of Buffalo. He was teaching writing at the YMCA. He was focusing more on young adult novels. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, like I said, he was killed in a car crash. A chance to write his autobiography or his memoir and tell the Ranger story.
Well, now, obviously that one, The Lone Ranger, was a huge success for him. And I didn't realize that there was 2 different writers involved, or probably more than that, between the radio show and the TV show. But did this guy Striker, was this his biggie? Was this his big adventure or big creation, or did he have something else afterwards that rivaled it?
Well, he also wrote The Green Hornet, and I found out
that's pretty big too. Yeah.
Yeah. The Green Hornet is actually a descendant of the Lone Ranger. I can't remember if it's his grandfather or great grandfather. Yeah, they're the Reed family. Okay. So it's like heroes within the family. So I think the Lone Ranger was certainly the biggest, most successful thing that Striker wrote in terms of money making. But the Green Hornet, it's not far behind either.
Yeah. Well, that was a big one.
And just those 2 alone. I mean, no everything else he wrote. Just if he just stopped at those 2, that would have been a huge legacy to leave behind. But those are the 2 that he's primarily known for, and I think most proud of. I think the Ranger was very near and dear to Striker's heart. He felt a really keen responsibility to that character that he created. And Striker developed a kids club, like I said, and he developed this ethics, this code of honor that kids should follow to be like the Ranger. And from family, friends, and from Fran Striker Jr.'s book, it seems like that creed was really an extension of Striker's own beliefs. Yeah. And they're very, very patriotic, very Christian, but also very educational. Like, don't Ranger use grammar, because he didn't want the kids to have poor grammar. He wanted the Ranger to be really up on that pedestal. The Ranger could never be depicted drinking or smoking. And if he was in a saloon, it should be represented as a cafe, and should be serving food instead of alcohol. And so now, if you look back and say, "Well, that must have been a saloon, right?" But Striker was very conscious and felt a real responsibility to keep the Ranger a pure American hero. And I think maybe that's why it's lasted 9 decades.
Yeah, without a doubt. Did he have any influence in, you said that he didn't really take part in the TV part, right?
Yeah, at that point, he retired back to Buffalo, and I don't think he did much writing. He did, like I say, leave behind guidelines for the writers that included things like, don't have him smoke or drink,
right.
What have you. Only never shoot and kill, only to disarm, and only if you have to. Yeah. So he left like how the Ranger should be portrayed if he wasn't writing the scripts.
Yeah. Well, the reason I asked that question is I wondered if he had any influence over who was selected to play those parts in the TV show, or was he just completely out of that? It's just only the book.
Yeah, I think he was, by that time he had written, all the radio scripts, or was the head writer for all the radio shows. He would write, when the loan of the supermarket, he would those out of a supermarket opening or a Boy Scout meeting. So he did all that. But after 1954, I think he was ready to move on and explore other writing projects.
Okay. And the Green Hornet came after that, right? So that would have been one of those projects that came after it?
The Green Hornet Green Hornet premiered on radio, so he was still working for Trendle at WXYZ when the Green Hornet made its premiere. Okay. And again, wildly successful, and a lasting icon today. And so, I would not be surprised if you pick up a magazine or Variety and you see that there's going to be a new movie or a new Netflix series about the Green Hornet or the Lone Ranger, because it just seems these are enduring characters that get rebooted, every so often to reintroduce them to a new generation.
Yeah, I kind of expect that because, I see all these shows that I grew up with. I won't mention any of them by name, but a bunch of shows that I grew up with, I'm seeing reboots. I'm seeing, a new edition of it. As some of them are coming out like now, and as popular as the Lone Ranger was, I would assume that would hit it if they can get away with it. Because again, the way the cancel culture is right now, and the way people are so easily offended, I'm not sure that an Indian character could be portrayed in the way that it appeared to be portrayed in the TV show that I watched. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Anyway, we're going to continue this discussion, and I'll let you pick up on that point in the second half of the podcast. We're going to break away here for just a couple of minutes, and we will be back with the second half of It's Primetime Somewhere. And I hope you guys are enjoying it. We sure are. And we'll be back right after the break again with the second half of, I like our little show. Anyway, we'll be back in just a minute.
Attention podcasters, influencers, media personalities, content creators, and aspiring or existing radio personalities. KRRB Revelation Radio now offers the opportunity to broadcast or syndicate both new or existing shows to all 50 states and more than 160 countries around the world. And if you currently operate a radio station, we offer you the opportunity to add several popular shows in virtually every genre for broadcast on your station. Choose programming from 30 minutes to 2 hours, with each internationally syndicated show adding quality content sure to grow your listening audience. We even have excellent optional services to help you promote your show or station. These services are not only designed for audio use on the radio, but also include tools for use on social media, even YouTube. For more information, visit www.revelationradio.net or email the Ustreamit LLC Broadcast Network at office@ustreamit.net today.
And welcome back, everybody, to the second half of It's Primetime Somewhere. And again, Stephen, I'm going to let you pronounce your last name because I can't, but I'm going to remind everybody that my name is J.D. Williams, and my guest today is, and you're up.
Stephen Eoannou.
I wish I was smart enough to be able to pronounce people's names. I really do, but I'm just not.
I thought you'd be braver. I thought you'd be braver in the second half of the show. Give it a try.
I'm a coward when it comes to last names. I've mutilated enough of them in my time, so I try to stay away from that. But Anyway, where were we when we broke away there? I know that you were going to reply to something I said, and I don't even remember what I did. Again, I'm 64 years old. Go ahead. You speak. You know what you're doing. I don't.
Yeah. You were talking about you weren't sure if there'd be a reboot of the Lone Ranger and depict the relationship between the Ranger like it was in the 50s. Maybe not, but there's enough source material. I mean, the original Striker wrote the original story that the Lone Ranger was a survivor of a massacre. He was the lone survivor of other Texas Rangers who were killed by the evil outlaw Burt Cavendish and his Hole in the Wall gang.
Yeah, I remember that.
And Tano was the person who found the Lone Ranger and nursed him back to health. And they were best friends, not only partners, but they were best. The whole sense of the term. And I think if people went back to that original Striker's vision for that relationship, I think that it certainly could be rebooted if that was the spirit of the relationship.
Yeah. Well, I think that they could pull it off. I'm just saying I don't think they could run it the way that they did back when it was original. You know, they'd have to kind of get in line with current culture, and I'm not sure if that would play the same or not. You know, I mean, reboots don't seem to normally do as well as the originals anyway. But that's just me.
Well, the Johnny Depp movie that we talked about in the first half of the show, I mean, it did not do well. It bombed at the box office.
Yeah.
And I think kind of deviated from the Lone Ranger formula that Striker had laid out. I think one did a true reboot that was true to Striker's vision. As this person who is out righting wrongs and sticking up for the little guy and fighting crime with his best friend, I think that would take hold. Yeah. And I think that was one of the reasons why it was so successful in the 1930s during the Depression, because people were losing their homes, they were being foreclosed, they were losing their jobs. And then here came this figure on a white horse who was righting wrongs, taking care of the little guy who was being mistreated, and into something in the culture of the 1930s. Because people were suffering through no fault of their own, and they were blaming Wall Street and big banks, and they were the ones who were suffering, and here was a hero that was trying to save them. And I think that's why the Ranger became so popular then. And I think if it was written the correct way, I think it could be as successful today.
Yeah. Well, the show actually gave hope, and I think that you kind of expressed that it gave hope to people during a very hopeless period of time. The Depression was no joke. People really struggled, and they needed that hope. They needed something to latch on to and take their mind off of everything that was going on, and that series, that show really did that, didn't it?
It did. If you think about it, if there wasn't that Depression, or if Striker didn't have so many extended family members that he had to support, would he have sold the rights to the Lone Ranger? Would it have taken off? Because Trendle had the business acumen, and they finally got a sponsor after almost a year. Now financial backing to take the Lone Ranger nationally. It may have been doubtful that Striker could have pulled that off at a little radio station in Buffalo called WEBR. Mm-hmm. So the Depression was huge to the Lone Ranger popularity, as well as the backstory of its creation, I think.
Yeah. Well, now, we talked about the fact that he sold this for only $10. And I'm wondering if there was more to the story of why it only sold for $10. I mean, in other words, did the guy that paid the $10, was he wondering whether or not this thing had a real future to it, or did he think $10 was a major risk? I mean, just $10.
No, because Stryker was selling part of what he was doing, and this is how Trendle and Stryker crossed paths originally. Taking old radio scripts that he had written and had premiered on WER here in Buffalo, and we're taking them and selling them to other radio stations across the country for between $2 and $6 an episode.
Okay.
Again, just for money, because he held all the rights to his work up until the Ranger. And Trendle, by the time he asked Stryker to write a Western series, was buying, I think, 3 or 4 episodes a week from Stryker at around between $2 and $4 an episode. So Trendle knew that $10 for an entire series was pretty low. If he was paying almost half that much for just a single episode.
Yeah.
And when he made that offer in the spring of 1934, it was just taking off. They had gotten a national sponsor 3 or 4 months ago, and more radio stations across the country were tapping into WXYZ's broadcast out of Detroit to broadcast the Ranger series. It was in syndication, if you will. Moved. Originally, it was on the Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday slot. It was eventually moved to Friday because that was more of a prime time. And then eventually, after it really took off, it was on Thursday nights at 8 o'clock. So it was a prime time show. But when Stryker signed that deal, they were just taking off. Mm-hmm. So I think Stryker knew it was special. I don't think anyone knew it was going to be something that's endured 90 years.
Right.
But he had all this family he had to take care of. And this was the only way he could see where he could possibly pull that off. And I think Trendle took advantage of that.
Yeah. Well, $10 was a heck of an investment for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that was for the rights. Think about all the spin-off, the toys, the giveaway items, the comic books, the books the novels that Stryker wrote. First radio characters that really became a marketing machine, generating all these other income streams in. You know, there's Little Orphan Annie and later on Roy Rogers, but the Lone Ranger was one of the first who was really bringing in money from these spin-off merchandise.
Yeah. So how long did it take you to write the book, from the time that you decided to do it until the time that you submitted your manuscript?
I think from the time I first started research until the time that the book's going to come out this October, so it's about 4.5, 5 years.
Yeah.
During that time, though, you know, I had my first novel, Rook, came out. That's about a Buffalo bank robber, another historical fiction piece. COVID happened, so that kind of delayed publication of things, slowed everything down. But yeah, it was about 4.5, 5 years that I've lived with the Ranger. And like I said, it was a fun book to read about and a fun book to write about. And I think people are going to find it's a fun book to read.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that you did a lot of research on it, which is good. You know, I've interviewed a lot of authors, and you'll be surprised. Some of them 3 months from beginning of concept to writing submission. 3 months. To me, that's a little quick. Yeah. To me, that's just a little fast. But you know, I mean, I'm not saying their books aren't any good. I don't know.
Sure.
But it seems like, you know, the more time you put into it, unless you're just stuck, you know, the more time that you put into it, then obviously the better the finished product is going to be. Let's talk a little bit, just for a minute. I know we really want to focus on Yesteryear, but you have written other books, and I kind of like to know your background on that, and
Sure.
what you've done, and where people can find those books as well.
Yeah, the first book that came out was called Muscle Cars, and it's a collection of 17 short stories. And I say it's 17 stories about guys making bad decisions. Semi-autobiographical. That came out about 7 years ago, and it's published by SFWP, the same press that's publishing Yesteryear. And that was one of the literary award winners from SFWP, and that was my first book. That's available everywhere that you can buy books. You can order it. You can go to my website or SFWP. Last year, my first novel came out, and it's called Rook. And that's based on the true story of a man named Nussbaum. And it's set in the early 1960s, a true story. By all accounts, Al was this upstanding citizen, married, he had their first child. He had a couple small businesses he was running, including, he claims, the first Mexican restaurant in Buffalo. And he would tell his wife that he was going to go out of town for business. But Al's business was robbing banks.
Oh,
and he robbed about surprise, honey. he robbed about 5 or 6 before his wife or J. Edgar Hoover knew who he was and what he was up to.
Okay.
And things went bad. December of I guess it was 61 or 62. He was robbing a bank in Brooklyn, and his partner shot and killed a bank guard and wounded a New York City police officer. That shot Al and Bobby to the top of the FBI's most wanted list, and they called Al the most cunning fugitive alive, because not only couldn't they catch him, he kept robbing banks. And Al was a chess player. He loved to strategize, and robbing banks was like chess for cash money. For cash prizes. He loved the challenge of it. He loved fooling the police. And the only reason he got caught is because he came back to Buffalo, his wife and baby, and they were going to run away to South America, and his mother-in-law off the FBI that he was in town. So he was to 14 years in prison. And he served half of that, but while in prison, he became a writer. So he was writing for, if anyone remembers, Scholastic books. That I grew up with. In the 70s.
Me too. Yeah.
About writing some of those. He wrote for Ellery Queen and Alfred Hitchcock magazine, so a penny a word guy. And then once he was paroled in 1976, no, I guess I got that wrong. He was sentenced to 30 years. He served half of that. When he got paroled in 76, he went out to L.A. and became involved in the TV industry and writing scripts out there. But on the way, he had to stop in Vegas because he had buried a suitcase full of money in the desert. And when he got out to Nevada,
that's great.
They had, 14 years had gone by. They had built like a strip mall where he had buried the money. So either some construction guy went home with an American Tourister full of cash, or it's still sitting under all the concrete by Eldon.
Buried deep.
Eating cash.
Yeah.
And so Yesteryear, coming out in October, is my third book, my second novel.
Third book and second novel. And again, people can purchase those just about anywhere. But I know you have a website, and I want you to be able to let people know about that, as well as how to contact you, which I assume is through that website as well. I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, and you can see on the screen, it's SG and then my last name, all lowercase, all one word, .com. And if you go out there, you can see where to order my books, where to pre-order Yesteryear. There's a contact page where you can reach out to me. I love hearing from readers. You can do that. There's some excerpts out there, interviews, a bunch of stuff about me and my books. So sgeoannou.com.
Awesome. And yes, that is on screen for everybody to see. I encourage you to go out and get it. Now, you've written 3 books. And I love hitting authors with this. It's my unexpected moment there, because I love everybody's got a great response to this question. Okay, it's just like I have 5 kids. Okay, and somebody will ask me, which one's your favorite? So you got 3 books. Which one's your favorite?
Man, that's a tough call, because the muscle car's the firstborn. You got but Rook is the middle child. It was my first novel, and now Yesteryear is just so much fun. It's tough to pick. So on any given Sunday, as they say in football, which one's my favorite?
I'm going to take the pressure off of you. You know, that's always an unfair thing to ask because you know they were all your favorite when you wrote them, right? Every single one of them, just like when you have a newborn kid, that newborn child is always your favorite until they do something stupid, and then you go back to somebody else. Anyway, okay, go ahead.
I knew, though, from the first 20 pages of the very first draft of Yesteryear that was different. Okay. It's written in a different style than the first two books. The first two were very taut, kind of crime novels, very spare language, and I think I must have felt kind of constrained by that after two books back to back. And so I said earlier in the first part of the show that I was thinking about The Natural and Shoeless Joe, right? And I wanted to write something that really was very, much more lush in terms of language, much more magical. And so because those two influences were baseball books, I had this mantra going that I would say to myself, swing for the fences while you're writing this book, swing for the fences. And what I meant by that is like, no sentence could be too long or winding or flourishing. No joke could be too broad. No stroke could be broad. I was just going to swing for the fences. And my editor at SFWP, I'm sure I took years off his life as we edited that last year because there was no restraint on my part. Adam did a great job.
Well, now this is another sort of unfair question, but also one that needs to be asked, and that is, you've written 3 books. It took you, 4 or 5 years to write this one. Are you done? Yeah. Or do you have another project in mind that you're going to follow this up with?
Well, I'm just getting started, man. Life starts at 60. Right?
There you go. There you go. Okay, I love it.
COVID, was such a terrible time. And so many of my creative friends, writers, visual artists, they couldn't write at all. I mean, the news was just too awful and scary, or they were sick, or friends or family, and they just could not create. I kind of took the opposite. I was alone in a big house with a little one-eyed dog, and I was tired of watching the news. There was nothing good on Netflix, so I decided I was going to write something that entertained me. And we read to escape. I wrote to escape. So I tell people that I have a pandemic now, even though it has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's set in the 40s, Buffalo, New York. It's about an alcohol private detective with a little one-eyed dog. And he wakes up on the floor of his hotel room, and he checks his gun, and 2 bullets have been fired from his gun, and he doesn't remember anything about what happened. Okay. And so he needs to piece together the 5 days of an alcoholic blackout and try to find the woman who's missing that was last seen with him, piece together his days and his life. So that book only took me a couple years. I call it the pandemic novel because I started right at lockdown and I finished it almost 2 years later. And that book is called After Pearl, placed after Pearl Harbor. And that's going to be published 2025 by SFWP. So we're going through the edits on that one now. And I think that might be a series. I think we might see at least a couple more novels. So stay tuned.
So, and you've never done a series before, right? Every book's been
funny story. Yeah, funny story. So when I wrote this detective novel, After Pearl, I showed it to my friend Carla Damp, wonderful novel called The Orchid Tattoo. She's a crime writer. And she read a question she asked was, is this a series? And I said, no, it's just a standalone. I just wrote it during the lockdown. And then I showed it to my writer friend, Ashley Warlick, who, a phenomenal writer. Her last novel was The Arrangement. And the first question she asked me, well, is this a series? And I said, no, it's a standalone. I just wrote it during the pandemic. I showed it to my publisher at SFWP. Said, is this a series? Because I think Netflix would get it. And I said, yes. Yes, it is. But I had no idea what this will be. So I got some work to do, but I got some ideas.
Well, and they teed you up. That's good.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. I do not know much about publishing. Obviously, I'm not an author. I'm a radio guy sometimes. Anyway, how difficult is it for somebody to get a book published? I assume that's rough. And can you tell me a little bit about your publisher?
Yeah, it is rough. It's hard, and I was never able to get an agent, and it helps to pave the way, especially to some of the bigger presses that are out there. The way I broke in was a long shot. I was, a slush pile guy. I had no representation for anything, so I would just submit stuff on my own, throw it over the transom, and hope somebody read it and liked it. So what I did, I guess this is going back to 2013 or so. SFWP is a independent press, internationally distributed, solid reputation, and they were handling their annual literary awards. And the prizes was you get a book published if you're selected. And so that year, the judge, David Morrill, who wrote the Rambo series, and he picked Muscle Cars as one of the winners.
Wow.
And so that came out in 2020, and that really opened the doors. That really got my foot in the door. And as I said, Yesteryear and After Pearl will be published by the same press, starting in October with Yesteryear, then 2 years later with Pearl.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right. It's tough. It's tough out there. A lot of competition, a lot of good books being written, a lot of books being published, and so it's tough to break in, and then the work's not over at that point. Now you have to market the book.
Right.
Now you have to. That's maybe the hardest part. But getting better. I'm getting better. So
do publishers? I mean, you like you said, you got your foot in the door. You got published because you had a book that they really liked. Okay,
yeah.
And so I assume, maybe I'm wrong, and you can correct me, but I assume it's a little bit easier the second time around because you've got a relationship with a publisher and that type of thing. But do they come to you, or do you say, I'm ready to do another one, or do they say, hey, how about another one? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it's the publisher, especially if you're a success for them. They're going to be asking periodical, what are you working on?
Okay.
Do you have any pages for me to see yet? I was able to come up with After Pearl pretty quickly, and I had no idea if anyone would like this book that I wrote pretty much just for myself during the pandemic. And like I said, Andrew Gifford, the founder of SFWP, one of the first questions he asked was, "Is this going to be a series?"
Yeah.
So, we kind of have a verbal agreement that there will be more Nicholas Bishop stories coming down the pike. So.
Yeah, it seems like you got your future laid out pretty much right there. All right, now we've only got a couple of minutes left in the podcast, and I want to give you an opportunity to hammer home anything that you want to. Of course, tell us once again the name of the book, where it can be found, and of course your website address and how to contact you. But anything that I have that I have left out or haven't asked about, or something that you just want people to know, you got a couple of minutes. It's all up to you now.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you having me on today. Yesteryear is coming out October 3rd, but you can pre-order it now. And pre-orders are really a huge benefit to the author, because that's going to generate buzz within the industry, and more bookstores will carry the book if they see if you have strong pre-order numbers. It gets the attention of the Amazons of the world, so they promote the book more. It really helps. So even though you might not get the book for several months, if you could pre-order it, I would really be appreciative of that. You can do that through Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, my publisher, SFWP.com, or my website, sgeoannou.com. And there you'll find links where you can order not only Yesteryear, but Muscle Cars and Rook as well. So, and like I said, once you get it and read it, I'd love for you to come back to my website and leave a note and let me know what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. The more reviews, the more positive 5 stars that you can get, it's better all the way around. Yeah. Again, I do strongly encourage people to go out and get a copy of this thing, because anytime that an author really puts as much time and effort into something as Stephen has obviously done with this book, again, the title is Yesteryear. It is going to be available in October of 2023. Stephen, I really appreciate you being on the podcast today. It's Primetime Somewhere. I wish you nothing but great success. I'm looking forward to grabbing a copy of the book and, of course, looking at the series when it comes out, now that you've been forced into writing a series for the first time, right?
I'm on public record now. So
there you are. Yes, you are. Okay. Well, I really do appreciate you being on today, and I wish you nothing but the very best and the greatest of success. And thank you so much for being on It's Primetime Somewhere.
Thank you so much, JD.
God bless.